Hey everyone, David here from ChessDojo, and today I'd like to teach you by example about how to make a profile of yourself as a chess player. You can also apply this to other people to some extent, although it'll be somewhat harder to do because you might not know the thought processes behind their mistakes or what their tournament situation was or what the clock situation was or their mental state was during the game that you analyzed. But you can still do, a whole bunch of stuff, and it's not like people don't make profiles on each other. I've made a lot of profiles on a lot of players over the years. But today we're going to look at how to make a profile for yourself. This is a super useful thing to do for anybody over 2,000 or maybe even lower, as deflation has hit us so hard. There are stronger and stronger players below 2,000 for whom it may be useful to have a profile. One of the reasons that a profile is super useful is because it can help direct your training towards areas that you would most benefit from working on. Now, as I say that it's particularly useful or even necessary for players over 2,000, I think players over 1,500 can start doing this profitably. Now, a player over 1,500 is going to make more mistakes at several stages along the way, and therefore by the time you get to the profile, and some of those errors have compounded and percolated, the profile may be quite inaccurate, but it's a nice thing to start doing because most of it is self-analysis, which is great work, and it sort of gets you started on the path towards doing it. Okay, so let's start over here for a second. And what you have before you is a normal game analysis, right? And you can see that I have some text over here, some variations on a game. We've got a warning here from Jesse, and you can play through the game, you can put on some comments, alternate variations, etc. So that is a game analysis, and that's a separate thing, which for the purposes of making your own profile, I assume that you're already able to do to some extent. And again, as I said, this is for players, as low as 1,600 to do this. Those game analyses don't need to be as long or as complicated as one that a 2,000 player would do, which doesn't need to be as complicated as the one which a 2,400 player would do. But ideally at this point, your game analyses are revealing at least one or two potential errors or weaknesses in each game that you analyze. So we're going to start with this. We've got a game analysis. And then what I'm going to turn your attention to is this. This is just how I'm going to show it. It wouldn't need to be in this form here, but this is now a list of game analyses from one tournament. And so we can scroll through the game analyses, and at the end of the game analyses, there's the end of the first game. I've got some comment about the game, in this case with feedback from a stronger player, which I was lucky to get, but let's go to another one maybe. And here you see a very, very simple high-level summary of the game that's been analyzed, right? So we need to be able to analyze the game and get into the details when we're doing the analysis. But when we're going to do a profile of ourselves, we need to be able to step back and look at the forest in a sense, as if every game were one tree. Does that make sense? So, so here we've got a very, very simple take on the game. And this kind of a thing I would often put at the end of my analysis in a game, a comment like that. And often when I analyze my games, it'll start with a little paragraph with some questions about the game. Let's see, we're right here at the top of the game. No, this one is mildly analyzed because it's a very, very simple, so to speak, game. But here, at the start of a game, some kind of thing of what are we looking at in the game, right? And at the end of the game, something about what we have done or learned from the analysis of the game, what our conclusion are, right? So this one here, I'm going to scroll a little so you can see it better. Reads, okay, opening, opponent plopped the knight d5 and the accelerated dragon, forcing a lot of exchanges and a simplified position where there was nothing exciting for me to do. I was careful, serious, and accurate. Exchanges led to dead draw pretty quickly. So actually, I still had to be careful. I envisioned potential dangers and didn't assume that it was going to be an easy draw and worked for it in this case. Okay. So that's what you have then. So here I have it like organized by tournament. That's just my way. So I've got all the games from this one tournament here with little summaries of like what happened in the game below the game, which I can scan through more quickly in order to start thinking about patterns over multiple games. So then next I made this file here. And this file goes game by game through every game I've played for the last 2 years, which is not very many. Now, a profile is going to require at least 10 games, and the more games you add to it, the better it's going to be. And normally you'll need more than 20 games for the profile to start being accurate. And one of the things we're going to be looking for in a profile is something like, how often do you win in the opening? How often do you lose in the opening? How often do you win in the middle game? How often do you lose in the middle game? How often do you win in the end game? How often do you lose in the end game? That's very, very basic level, but hopefully that makes sense to you as like, if I just compiled that stats, it might tell me something about it, right? And I think now some sites like chess.com probably compile some versions of information for you on your blitz games, so it's not what I'm most interested in, but you could maybe they have a tool where you could import your OTB games into a library and do a similar thing. But certainly like for your blitz games, they'll tell you something like, here's the average length, here's the accuracy, here's how you do in this opening versus that opening. You can break stuff down like that. We're going to do a similar thing here, but with a more accurate human touch, right? Where you know yourself better, but it also involves at some level just compiling some basic stats, right? Are you doing better in the openings or the end games, etc.? So what I've done here is I just copy pasted the little sign-offs from each of the games, the little mini blurbs. I can add something here. Structure I was unfamiliar with. Put in some things because I remember it. A lot of times I kind of like remember these, so when I read the little summary, it triggers my memory and I remember other things if I need to. Like, do I need to know on what move did the game end? I haven't written everything into these little blurbs, but I see the blurb and I can tell you, for example, this Rohrer game, we made time control and then did a long calculation and found that the game was a forced draw and played about 5 or so more moves. So I know that game was about 45 to 46 moves. This one here, I know that it sort of petered out and traded off into a very brief endgame somewhere between moves 28 and move 35 and did not go to the second time control. So yeah, I have that memory that gets triggered by the little explanations and blurbs. If I just saw the name of the player or just like the round, I might not remember. Like today I was looking through my game history and I saw some tournament I played, one of my more recent tournaments, but 6 years ago, and it had some round I played with Steven Zierk, and I can't remember it at all. I remember playing Steven Zierk in the Backyard Invitational. I remember that encounter, but I completely don't remember having played him in this tournament. So, but if I had a little blurb about it, right, like saying like, oh, King's Indian defense, where, you know, things got messy and he was in time trouble, even that little might bring the whole game back to me. I mean, not move by move necessarily, but I would, that game, you know, and a lot of it does come back. Okay, but I was talking briefly about how many games you want to have. I have here only 14 games from the last 2 years because, as many of you know, I don't get to play very often anymore. 14 games is going to be slim pickings as far as the stats, right? Like when we see what percentage of games do I win or lose in the opening, or do I win or lose in the end game, you know, you're going to be talking somewhere between 1 and 5 games out of 14. And the stat's not going to be so useful because the sample size is small compared to the stats you're looking at, right? Because it might look like I think in this sample size, I only had 1 miniature out of 14. But if you looked at a larger sample size of my games, you would find that I have more frequent miniatures than that in general, right? But if I'd had just 1 more miniature out of 14 here, right, then it would have been, I've got, 14.5% miniatures instead of 7% miniatures. So it would make a real big difference in terms of what that sounded like and looked like. So when you've got a small sample size, it's not as good for like crunching like the stats about how you're doing in different phases. And a profile like this would be much better with, 20 to 100 games, really. The reason I picked a small sample size is because after my first kid was born 9 years ago, I had a really long layoff, and I spent many sleepless nights, and I forgot openings that I'd learned before. I changed around things about my repertoire and my training, and I aged. And so all of that means I'm kind of a different player than I was before, so those older games are not so useful anymore. Also, it'll make this video a little bit easier with a more bite-sized chunk of games to scroll through and go over than if I had hundreds. But yeah, ideally you would have a bit more. So, if you want to do a profile like this and you've got 10 games, first concentrate on playing one or two more tournaments, and then work up a profile on yourself. And, priorities are always important. And for most people, the priority is to go play more tournaments. And a select few play tons of tournaments and need to do more work on their tournaments. But for those of you who fall into that category, this profile is definitely for you. So now you see, basically, I've got just a list. Seems I even forgot one opponent's name or something. I've got a list of games with little blurbs about how the game went. So that's the next step, right? And then I went to make a spreadsheet. And there are a few joys, like the joy of making a spreadsheet, right? And now we can look at this. So here, obviously, I broke things down into some categories. So I've got some questions about my opening play, my middle game play, my end game play, calculation, time trouble, and scrolling down, just overall losses. And then you can make recommendations at the end. It's not necessary, but it's part of the point of making a profile is that then you're equipped to, make some training recommendations for yourself from that point. And there's not just one set of like questions or things to look at here. But I'll show you some of the things I looked at and propose some other directions it could go and tell you why I picked them. So the first thing I picked was the evaluation in the opening. So that's basically like coming out of the opening, did I have a good or bad position? Okay, and here out of 14 games, I had 2 where I came out winning, 3 where I came out like doing better than I would think is normal, 5 that were close to okay, so that's somewhere between equal or maybe a slight advantage for white, maybe an acceptable slight disadvantage as black, nothing that felt out of the ordinary or like it was really going to decide the game. Then 2 where I felt like I was markedly bad and 2 where I was completely losing. And overall that shows a balance, like I'm not losing the opening more than I'm winning. Again, it's not a huge amount of data, but if you assume you doubled the sample size, you had 28 games and 4 losing and 4 winning, etc., at the same kind of ratio, then you could maybe say with more certainty some of the things that we might say here. But one thing somebody pointed out is like 2 games where you're losing straight out of the opening out of 14 seems like a lot for an IM. And I said, well, but yeah, I've got 2 that I'm winning and, it's kind of like balanced. But if you think about it in this sample size, I'm almost entirely playing players who are lower rated than myself. And the 2 games that I came out of the opening losing, I lost both of them. So one might say that if I came out of the opening with, more okay games and less winning or losing games, I would have more chance to outplay the opponent. And so maybe it is a little bit of a problem or a weakness to have those games where you're straight up losing. I also, along the lines of this thought, what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you this thing here that I put under normal. I'll just move it for you for a second. and put it here. I just kind of imagine what would be normal for most people. Someone playing more theoretical openings and with more knowledge of their opening and less freestyling in the opening. Well, maybe they would have something more like 1 winning, 1 losing, 1 good, 1 bad, and 10 okay. Like a lot more games that would be closer to equal coming out of the opening because they and their opponents are playing theoretical openings where they know some of the moves and some of the ideas and they don't have to come up with as much on their own. Maybe that would be sort of a more normal baseline to compare this to for me. So anyway, I'll move that over there. That was just sort of a thought experiment. But anyway, we can draw some conclusions from that. Then I said, how many of my openings were theoretical openings versus unusual openings, right? So that doesn't mean that I knew the theory. As you'll see in the next line, familiarity. There was one game where I maybe knew some moves by heart. I mean, beyond move 6 or 7. Like when I play the Najdorf, I play the Najdorf, and on move 6, I generally know whether I want to play e6 or e5 or g6. It's not like I know absolutely nothing, but, there's, very few games where you can see very, very few games where I knew the moves beyond move 8, maybe none even. So 6 openings that were theoretical, even though I didn't know the theory, and 8 openings that were unusual, even though, so that's probably positions where neither I nor my opponent knows it. And then I just checked within the 6 theoretical games, did the games go more or less in my favor? And it was 1-1, 2-1, 1 as far as the evaluation coming out of the more theoretical set of openings. So I said that's no bias in favor of me. But if we consider that I'm stronger than the sample size, maybe anything that's sort of 50-50 is a slight bias against me. Maybe I need to rethink that point a little bit. So anyway, I mean, because I didn't know the theory, it was unlikely that I would benefit from it being theoretical. In fact, I'm probably likely to unbenefit, you would think, by being in a theoretical position where I don't know the theory because the chances are higher my opponent knows the theory. Whereas in the unusual positions, we both don't know what we're doing. But anyway, both were about 50-50 as far as how I came out of the opening. I guess I would say the more I think about it, this is a little bit disappointing, the evaluations that I've got coming out of the opening, because I should be pretty good at playing the opening in theoretical positions. In the 8 unusual positions, I would expect myself to outplay somebody else who doesn't know the opening. So that's a little bit unfortunate. And then I was also playing a lower rated sample size than me. So actually, let's go add this to the conclusions. It's in the recommendations, right? Opening work. Okay, but I'll add this note in parentheses here. Considering the opposition was weaker, coming out of the openings 50-50 is not a good situation, right? I mean, I should be coming out of it with some percent of an advantage if I'm the better player. Okay, so that we add there. Then familiarity. So there was one game where I was familiar with opening theory, let's say, and 4 games where I was familiar with the structure, but not the theory. Like, okay, we're in an open Sicilian structure that I recognize, or okay, we're in a French defense structure that I recognize, or something like that, right? That's a very, very high number of positions where I wasn't familiar with the structure, right? I could make that comment here. Shockingly high number of positions where I was unfamiliar with the structure. The thing is, I've played a wide variety of openings over the course of my career, and I've played through the games of a lot of grandmasters, read through lots of books, etc. So if I see the King's Indian defense pawn structure, like I know it, even if I've only played the King's Indian defense, 2 or 3 times myself in tournaments, I've played it in some blitz games, and I've seen, basically every game that Kasparov played in it, etc. Okay, and similar, right, for the French defense, isolated queen pawn, hanging pawns. I mean, there's so many structures I know. So this is a very, very unusually high sample of positions that I was unfamiliar with. And I can tell you off the top of my head what some of them were. Some of them were me playing closed Sicilians because I was trying the closed Sicilian for the first time in my career. And I was playing this sort of closed Sicilian / Grand Prix. Yeah, Grand Prix attack recommended by Jesse, which is, when I've played the black side of the closed Sicilian in the past, I've gotten different positions than what I tended to get here when I was the one picking the white moves, not the black moves. And then there was also, when I was playing black, people repeatedly, or a couple times, and it's a small sample size, but a couple times played quick bishop b5, bishop takes c6 variations against me because I was planning maybe to experiment with the Sveshnikov. And I used to mostly play like a Najdorf move order, so I didn't get these bishop takes c6 structures much. And I've seen, obviously, a bunch of Carlsen and Caruana games in bishop b5 Sicilians, but somehow I haven't analyzed their games deeply, and the structures still are a bit unfamiliar to me. So that's part of the unusual structure. And then there was also just a mix of, games going haywire, me playing some new variations. Like, it was a lot of experiment. Let's put that. Lots of experiment. I mean, like almost every game I experimented. For example, I played one King's Gambit, but then I played an experimental variation that I invented over the board that was terrible instead of something that I know. I played the white side of a Grunfeld, and instead of playing my pet line that I've played most of my career, or even something related to it, I played a completely new variation just over the board that I was like, oh, I'll try this variation. I think Kramnik played it at some point, but I don't remember his game. So I really put myself in a situation of very, very low familiarity. Okay, then we looked at the errors, just like total error count. I think I made about 8 errors, 4 of them in 2 games, meaning that's only 6 games out of 14, about 50% of the games, and 2 of them had multiple errors. Overall, the error number, I didn't find it super dramatic. Maybe my standards should be higher for myself. The error number I didn't think was terrible, but now as I think more and more about how I should do better in the opening, maybe it is a bit much as far as errors. Anyway, this could be tightened with less experimenting, so that's one option. We could put it here under recommendations. Should I stop experimenting in classical tournaments? Like, if I want to experiment, at least, play the opening for 200 blitz games and then go do it in a tournament. That could be considered, right? But I was working on Jesse's aggressive repertoire, for example, and I'd only had time to spar it, 10 times or something like that over, 50 positions or whatever, over 25 positions, each of which I should repeat 6 to 10 times, in my opinion. So there was just tons and tons of open territory where I didn't have any experience yet. And then miniatures, just keeping track, how many are there and am I winning or losing them? There was one of the 2 games where I was losing where arguably I should have resigned and it should have been 1-1 on miniatures. So I was just stubborn there, and so I lost in the middle game instead of in the opening. So 1 miniature went my way, and that's something that maybe you have no miniatures ever and you don't even have this line and you don't have to track it. You don't have to track every single thing I track necessarily. These are just some ideas of things you can track, and it can be developed and changed over time. Middle games, I thought about, evaluation problems. Was I fundamentally misevaluating? Like, sometimes you're playing along, you think your position's good, and oh no, it turned out the whole time you had a bad position, or the whole time you were afraid and suffering and playing and racking your brain and getting into time trouble, and it turned out the whole time your position was fine and you should have just played the sensible moves that you were evaluating as terrible for you. You could have just played them faster and kept going. So that was one thing that I thought was logical to look for, but as you can see, it didn't come up that much. There was one time where definitely I had an evaluation problem, and a second time where it could be argued that I might have had an evaluation problem, but it wasn't. But I'm not sure yet. I have to analyze the game more to decide if I was wrong about the evaluation. Out of 14 games, I struggled with my plan twice. And I know one of those times I had the overall plan, I just couldn't pick how to do it, right? Like I knew what side of the board I was stronger on and that I wanted to bring pieces there and that I wanted to attack the square G2. But I didn't know which piece should attack G2 and in which order. And, once I forced my opponent to play G3 to defend G2, what was I going to do next? And instead of just moving forward and getting to that point, I agonized about it in advance and burned a lot of time and played slightly weird moves. So anyway, did I have a plan? Okay, struggled with the plan. I sort of had a plan, but I wasn't sure on the details of the plan. So there's two levels, right? There's like do you have a big plan? Do you have the small detail plans? Evaluation change. So how many times do I go into the middle game with a good position from the opening and turn it into an equal position or a bad position or a winning position, right? Or how many times do I come into the middle game with a bad position and turn it around into a good position? And here, again, it was pretty equal or bland. 3 times I improved my evaluation and 3 times I lost evaluation. So, so that part doesn't signal any particular strength or weakness, although again, we can say we're playing against a slightly weaker sample size in theory. I mean, I did overall, and this is the first stat to look at as well, it's important, it's just, I did overall score +3 out of 14 games, so maybe I was slightly stronger than my opposition. I mean, the ratings say I was slightly stronger, but the ratings are whatever, and my rating is maybe out of date. But the results also suggest maybe I was a little bit stronger. So in that sense, like anything that comes out even, we might consider to be might be slightly bad. Like where am I supposed to get my advantage against these players if I'm better than them? I mean, I should be doing something, right? Either getting better openings, or outplaying them in the middle game, or outplaying them in the end game, or outcalculating them at a key moment. There has to be somewhere where I'm doing something good. In theory, right? I mean, every profile should have some part that comes out well, unless we're literally losing every single game we play hopelessly. Okay, so anyway, so this is not amazing, but not a huge flag immediately. Decisive, depending on whether I count a certain game as having ended in the middle game or end game, because it ended sort of as we transitioned from one to the other, we could say that I scored 1 out of 4 in games that ended in the middle game, which I think would be 2 draws and 2 losses, or even 1 out of 5, which would mean 2 draws and 3 losses, which would mean almost all my losses were there in the middle game, right? And none of my wins, just a couple draws. So when we ask ourselves, when we look at that requires some kind of understanding of why it was. And I went back later and thought about it and realized there are some winning middle games where I missed the knockout and had to convert them in the end game. Some number of games where I'm going into the middle game with a good position, or maybe even my advantage grows. Some of these 3 good positions that grew to decisive proportions, but I just missed the knockouts and maintained the advantage and still won the games in the end game, but I'm missing the knockouts. And then another reason for like the losses being here is that in the bad positions, maybe I'm not making the decisions that force the opponent to play a winning end game. Maybe I'm doing something that's precipitating my defeat in the middle game. And we also have just, the fact that whatever miniatures I should have lost, I've waited a few moves to resign maybe. So a little bit of that doing it, but it's a little bit concerning, right? That if we're talking about decisive, like I didn't win a single game in the middle game, it's saying. I didn't find a single clean knockout despite having some winning positions, and I lost several times. To me, this is a flagged moment, right? This does pop up as an issue. Because it would be possible that some of the time when you miss the knockout that you're not necessarily winning the endgame after, or it takes a lot of work and you mess up the endgame. In this case, I didn't suffer too many points from missing knockouts because I basically converted all of those in the endgame, but it's costing you over a large sample size, I think, for most people. Okay. Endgame, eval change. So again, this at first felt sort of balanced to me when I looked at this stat. I gained half a point in 3 endgames, like from drawing to winning or losing to drawing. I think all 3 times was from drawing to winning. And I lost a full point 1 time from winning to losing. Oof. Which point-wise almost erases the other thing. Each gain was winning a drawn or advantageous endgame. Yeah. So some of them I'm going to the ending, plus equal, plus over minus, but winning it, and but bringing it to winning. And then obviously we can tell from this, where did I score my points? I mean, a good conversion rate in actually winning endgames. So a lot of positions where I went into the endgame winning, and then I won all of those except the one, right? Except the one where I got into time pressure and it was more complicated and I lost. And that's mentioned here. The endgame I blew had more pieces and more complication to it. Rook and 2 bishops versus 2 rooks and knights. It was tactical. There was calculation. I got into time trouble in the second time control. And that's the one I blew. Other than that, very high conversion rate on winning endgames. If you wanted to, you could break this down more, right? Very easily. Whoops. Okay, whatever, we'll do it here, right? You could do rook endgames if you had a larger sample size, for sure, right? Rook endgames, minor piece endgames, right? And you could see, oh, am I performing better or worse in rook endgames or minor piece endgames? Just like in the openings and the middle games, you can break it down by structures you know versus structures you don't know. Games where you had a plan versus you didn't. Did you score better in which of these positions, right? What was the impact of the different things? In my case, I basically won all these endgames, so I don't need this part yet, right? But over time, that would be something that one could add in if one was getting a lot of endgames and if your results in the endgame were more mixed, right? Like if your endgame result were something like 25 out of 47, then you might want to break it down a little bit more and see, like, did you do better in endgames with more pieces, less pieces? How did you do in your theoretical endgames? Just like in the opening, we have theoretical openings. We could put in a line here. Might even go here, where we do like theoretical. And you're just checking, like, did you ever, not win a Lucena or not draw a Philidor or, lose king and rook against rook and bishop or anything like that, right? Like, so how did you perform in theoretical known positions? So just some examples of, further areas that you could inquire there. Then we've got calculation, and you see I didn't get too deep into this just yet, but I just counted how many games did I feel like I struggled with the calculation, and I came up with 5 games where the calculation was an issue, like I was missing knockouts or blundering moves for the opponent. Honestly, this didn't even count. I didn't even count a game I blundered, I think, but that's a good next category, right? Just straight up blunders. And let's go through the game lists and hunt them down, right? Because that's how it works. And I'll show you an example now. I did a bunch of this work before recording the video, but now let's hunt one of them down. So we're looking for total blunders. So we just go game by game. Did I totally blunder this game at any point? Like, hangs, not a blunder the way, somebody who checks against the computer and is like, oh, there was a move that was 1.5, but I played a move that was 0.7, double question mark. No, we're looking for, did you hang a piece or did you not win the Lucena position or something like that, right? So this game here has some imprecision in it, but nothing that I would call a blunder. Not like a tactical calculation blunder. No. No blunders. This one I didn't find knockouts, but I didn't just blunder, I just couldn't find some difficult to find wins. So this one is a game that's an example of, like, I put it under struggled with the calculation, but it's not a blunder. This one here does have a blunder. This one here, no blunders for me. This one here, 2 blunders, no blunders. The opening was so bad that someone might be tempted to categorize this as a blunder, but it didn't lose the game. It just meant I was white and my position sucked, like maybe minus 0.6, minus 0.7. It's depressing. It's depressing at move, 8 or 9 to have a worse position as white, but it's not, I didn't hang a piece or something, It's not a blunder. This one here arguably has a blunder, so that's 3. And even that, it was more complicated than I would say a blunder. I don't think I'm even going to count it. I mean, both this game and this game, like I messed up on the calculation big time. It was difficult, but it's not just a blunder. It was a truly difficult situation. So we're going to go here and we're going to say 2. 2 full-on like game throwing blunders. It's not great for 14, honestly, even 2 for me. But at every level, it's like a different, right? Like if I were rated 1,000, I would be happy to have 2 blunders per game probably. If I were 1,600, I would want to be down to 1 blunder a game. If I were 2,000, I would want it to be like 1 blunder every 6 or 7 games. And at my level, I would want it to be 1 every 15 games, maybe. So 2 is, a little bit bad, maybe. We can double check the struggled. Yeah, it's between 5 and 6 for the struggled. That's pretty accurate. Okay, we could try and categorize these more, right? Like, you could say what percentage of these decided a game, or what percentage of these were when you were in time trouble, right? Or what percentage of these caused time trouble, which I get into a little bit in the next part, because for me, the calculation and the time trouble are super linked. They won't be for everybody, but for me they are, so I talked a little bit more about this here, I think. 8 games with time pressure, 5 of them it affected calculation decision-making noticeably in a negative way, right? So that's this, right? We're saying it's basically almost like perfectly, like every time I was struggling with calculation, almost, it was a game with time pressure. And the calculation is causing time pressure, and the time pressure is causing calculation mistakes afterwards. That I sort of figured out as kind of the loop. Time pressure related calculation problems. Okay, so, we can say we've got a loop. Time pressure causing poor calculation. No, the other comes first, right? Poor calculation causing time pressure, which then causes poor calculation, right? There's a typo here. Blunders 2. So we could say, did I calculate at the right time? And one way I would write this shorter if we want is decisive moments. But you could say, like, did you notice the decisive moments, or did you miscalculate at the decisive moments, right? But here it would be like, yes, I generally calculated at the decisive moments correctly. I just didn't do it well, right? Like even this game that I started with here, one thing that was really unusual about this game is that there was a decisive moment this early in the game at move 11. And that's one of the notes here. Jesse warned me that when playing this variation, you have to start thinking about some really important decisions crop up earlier than normal that you have to think about. And if you get them wrong, you're in a bad position for a long time. If you get them right, you can get a good position. So I did stop and think a long time here and find the wrong move, bishop b5 check. And this was the position where I needed to find bishop takes e7. So even here where I didn't find the right move, I was looking at the right time. And that's the important question about decisive moments here, right? We're asking ourselves not about the quality of our calculation, but the timing of our calculation. Did we stop and calculate at the right times? So that's what I put here on calculation, but you could put, is your calculation, are you calculating in locked positions where there's no tactics? Are you calculating one move too late, etc.? That sort of a thing, right? Okay, now let's get into the time trouble a little bit. So if we want it to be, so the first thing I did was I counted the games affected, 8 games. And then I thought about the origin of it. Like, what were those 8 games? What was the origin of the time trouble in those 8 games? So one was struggling with the details of the plan in the middle game, and that already started in the opening. 2 were I got a bad opening and it was a complicated position, so sometimes I think more when I have a bad position. 4 of them, it was because slow, bad calculation. And 1 time it was just straight up, a tricky position. It's not always wrong to get into time trouble, I think. Well, maybe it is, but like arguably there are games that are more difficult where both players are going to feel the need to use more and more of their time, right? So that's like the origin, and then obviously we highlight 4 times I think I was in time trouble because of slow, bad calculation. We already know I was mostly calculating at the right time, but right, that is like a big piece of the origin. Over here we've got the games affected. 8 games with time pressure, 5 of them it affected it. 2 of my 4 losses came from time pressure. Actually, that should go here with losses. 2 of my 4 losses came from time pressure. So we're going to put that here. And in this one, we don't need to put the bad openings part, right? Just say 2 of the 4 losses came from time pressure. That's games affected, right? We've got the origin of the time pressure. How often did I waste time? That's something I'm going to go back and do now. So we're going to go through these. This game here, I wasted time in the opening, worrying about stuff. Here I used my time, but it was important. Appropriate. Here I wasted a lot of time on one decision. See, it's in the comment. I remember it. This one where I was in time pressure. Did I waste time at any point? Not really. Did I waste time? No. Did I waste time? No. Did I waste time? No. Did I waste time? Not really. So basically 2 games where I really wasted time in positions where I shouldn't have been thinking so much. 2 times. Not terrible. It can be a little bit of a problem for me, but not the worst. Okay, if time pressure were a huge problem for you, which maybe arguably it's a noticeable problem for me right now, and you wanted to get deeper into it, there's more things you could put in here to get deeper into it. You could put in, at what move? Whoops. We can put at what move, or you could even get deeper than that and you can get more precise. Time at move 20, 30, 40, right? You could do a whole thing. And people who are real time trouble addicts, where that's what's crushing their games, they start setting goals for themselves, right? At move 20, I should have this much time left. At move 30, I should have this much time left. And then when they go and do their profile, they need to see how are they stacking up compared to those goals. This could be at the stage of identifying that you have that problem. You could say, how much time do you have at move 20, at move 30, at move 15, at move 35, however many you need to look at. And if you see, oh my gosh, it's dramatic problem, then that would lead you to a recommendation below, right? A recommendation of setting up a structure for yourself to think about your time better. Okay, and a basic thing to think about, of course, is just list out, the causes of your losses, right? So I know that 2 of them came from bad openings, 2 of them came from these sort of time pressure calculation things. So that's kind of what's going on. For recommendations, that leads to a couple recommendations. I think even though 2 losses came from bad openings and 2 came from time pressure, I feel like the time pressure, it's also endangering some of my wins, right? And I think overall it just has more of an impact on my game, even though the full points were exactly the same here. So I said more timed calculation exercises, right? This is something I already do, but that's where you give yourself very strict amounts of time to solve puzzles instead of just solving puzzles. And you're not solving, for me, it's not solving like, it's not like Puzzle Rush. It's not like 10 seconds. No, I need to be solving things that take 8 minutes, but making sure to solve them in 8 minutes instead of 15. Right? There's no interest for me in trying to solve puzzles that take 1 minute, really. Or, I mean, that's not like a main issue for me right now, though it could be for somebody. Because in general, you know, something that takes a minute to figure out is not super difficult. And if I find it out in a minute and a half instead of a minute, that's not what's getting me into time pressure. It's not what I'm blundering. It's not why I'm losing games for me. It's going to be harder things where I need to think for 5 to 10 minutes, but it's taking me 15 minutes. And it's tiring me out and it's using up my time, and sometimes I'm getting it wrong on top of that, right? So that's what I need to work on, are difficult. And then the other thing that obviously could be done would be some opening work. You know, we added this comment together earlier that coming out of the openings 50-50 is maybe not a good situation if the opposition's a bit weaker. And on top of that, I was quite unfamiliar with the positions, and that may have contributed a little bit to some of my time pressure in some games. Should I stop experimenting in classical tournaments? It's kind of a question to me. And then another possible recommendation is, let's think about, you know, do we even want to direct games towards Endgame, since the games that finished in the Endgame in general I did, that's where I had like the highest score. So there's some ideas for me to work on or to think towards. And that's that. That's basically a profile. You can always go further in depth on it, right? You can work it further in more detail, especially if you got more games to look into. And what categories you use can change over time. You can discuss them. And of course, you know, you might get something wrong. So it's very, very good, if possible, to get feedback as you try and make some kind of a profile for yourself. But ultimately, if you do this, I think it's invaluable. You really know yourself. You know what you want to be doing. You know what you should be working on. You're aware during the games of what might happen, so it can just affect how you handle that. And most of all, you can apply it to other aspects of your life as well, right? You can understand this is the kind of situation in life where I get angry, or where I get nervous, or where I get anxious, or where I get overconfident, you know, and figure these things out. Like my older profile was more like overconfident, you know, needlessly striving to complicate games because of overconfidence, always thinking I'm winning when I'm drawing and drawing when I'm losing and stuff like that. You know, it was a different profile. Now we've got a lot less optimism and brash confidence here, not moving too quickly, but more moving too slow. So a lot of things have changed. All right, I hope that's useful. If there's some important points that I didn't address or talk about, or just some cool questions that came up, it's a pretty endless topic, so there could be some questions that came up. Ask me, and I will do my best to further the discussion with you. All right, have a great day, everybody.